welcome to Strategic Thinker. I am really honored and delighted and very excited by having Jonathan Chocqueel-Mangan, and I apologize for my pronunciation, Jonathan.
That's fine.
You know that I try many times. And I'm very excited because with Jonathan today, we're going to go through some very interesting insights that he has developed in his incredible career that he has done so far in major corporations, but also from an academic standpoint, because he has a doctorate and a master in amazing topics, which I'm sure we're going to touch today. So I leave now Jonathan to introduce himself, but first of all, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. My background from my name is a combination of French, Irish, American, and I'm incredibly English, so a combination of all of those. I currently work as the Chief Strategy and Transformation Officer for BSI Group, which is a international standards business. I was previously the Chief Strategy Officer at Pearson, and before that the Chief Strategy Officer at Kantar, the market research firm. And before that I spent 20 years in consulting at the usual places, Anderson Consulting rather than Accenture, partner at KPMG and a partner at Hydrogen Struggles, where we did leadership consulting, and then I ran my own consulting firm as well. Oh, wow. So I've been a sort of corporate, an entrepreneur, consultant. I've sort of tried it all, and as you say, love learning. So started life as an engineer, as an aerospace engineer, then went into consulting, did a master's degree in change management at HSA and Oxford, and then went on to do my doctorate in organisational behaviour. So from sort of systems engineering all the way through to a social science.
Wow, this is really great. So we were discussing before about the topic that you're going to talk to us, and it's quite fascinating. Do you want to give us a little bit of context about the big challenges that and see how those translated in different gigs that you had across your career?
So there's a sort of theme to, I think, where I work best, where I'm happiest, if you like. And that is really working with incumbents who are facing a threat from digital business models, organizations that are recognizing that digital technology, data, AI now more than ever, allows you to build a business model that truly focuses on the customer. And incumbents essentially have always built themselves up using technology that is sort of aligned to the needs of a customer, but you haven't got a lot of choice as a customer, so you kind of live with it. As these small companies come along, using different technologies, that the barriers to entry have collapsed and they're able to offer exactly what the customer wants, whether that's a corporate looking for market research, whether it's a student looking for support through their education, or where I am now, whether it's an organisation want to use standards to improve their business. So the question I'm always focused on is, how do we as an incumbent fight back? And how do we make sure that we are able to become more flexible, more adaptive, and move away from the models that have made us successful in the past to new models that are unknown, potentially risky, but we've got to leverage the strengths that we have, which is our size, which is our customer base, which is our understanding of the market. So how do you make strategy in that kind of environment?
And where do you start from? How do you get the organization to realize that those challenges are real? Because I always say strategy is a little bit for illuminated people, because sometimes we go by the status quo. If strategy is the 50+1, we can only do, hope that around us things are not changing that quick. But you're talking about incumbent that might risk not to be incumbent anymore. So how do you, first of all, how do you identify those challenges, and how do you make the organization sufficiently aware so that they're ready to strategize our way around it?
So I think that there's a multifaceted answer to that question. I think the first is that the incumbents, certainly the ones I've worked with, fantastically talented people, but often have been there for a while. often not great with massive levels of ambiguity and uncertainty. I think what makes strategists annoying to the outside world is that we love ambiguity, we love uncertainty, we love the challenge of not really knowing the answer. We're unusual, I think. I think a lot of people, particularly if you're running a P&L, you need a bit of certainty, you need a bit of predictability. The second challenge is, I think, you've got to own the strategy. So there's no point in someone like me coming along and saying, oh, I've done some work, I've done some analysis, here you go, you just do these 5 things and it'll all be fine. So ownership is really, really important. So strategy then becomes about capability building as much as the right answer. Because I think there are 2 assumptions that we make about strategy that we say glibly, but we don't really think through, which is strategy is inclusive and strategy is emergent. It's like, yeah, obviously, you can't just have strategy in an ivory tower, but what does it really mean to be inclusive? And what does it really mean to be emergent? So how do you help an organization that is probably large, probably got some really good operators, be more adaptable and recognize that we probably don't know where the market's going. We just need to take educated guesses. So these are the challenges. They're largely internal. How do we help people beyond the strategy team be aware, be comfortable with ambiguity, be curious about the market, be open to new ideas and new business models? So how do you create strategy that will have that ownership and builds that capability across the whole organization, not just in the strategy function?
And now, 2 questions comes to my mind on what you're just saying to us. First is, when you're talking of such large organization, is there really an umbrella overarching strategic intent? Because if we're talking about Kantar or if we're talking about Pearson, they have different business divisions, they have different geographies. And what's your view in your work? There was an intent that then could be adopted and adapted in the different, or actually there is something that can actually cut across regardless of the business they are in, if it's textbook, if it's digital, if it is executive programs, or for Kantar, the different industries that they cover.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important question. Are you a holding company or an integrator? And I've always worked where our assumption is we're an integrator. So we have divisions, and often the problem is getting those divisions to work together where they've become dominant in their respective industries. But what the new digital startups are realizing is that they're product driven, they're not solution driven for the customer. So if I think about somewhere like Pearson, an extraordinarily brilliant organization, has huge amounts of information about the learner. And the learner is really the customer, not the teacher. And that was a real shift for Pearson. So if I'm a learner, I've been with Pearson throughout my school, potentially through university, and lifelong learning means most of my learning is done when I leave university. We have a huge amount of data. And therefore, you're not really buying a textbook. You're buying an option on a better career, on a job that will earn you money and enable you to provide for your family. So how do we look at what we're doing in the broader context? And how do we look at how those divisions come together to enable learners at any point in their lives to make great decisions because of all the data that we've got, whether they want to move into a new career, whether they want to leverage the skills that they already have, whatever that is. So it's always been about rethinking it in terms of what is the problem you're trying to solve. So Kantar was a good example where, often we did market research, but what I'd always ask people is, what is the problem or what is the decision that the client is going to make based on that market research? They don't want the market research, they want to make a decision. And they want that decision to be informed, and the market research does that. So often we would talk about the sample and the structure and the survey and the method. The client didn't care about that. What they wanted to know is, should we go into this market with this product or not? And what's the data we'll need to make a really good decision? So we're not selling market research. We're selling confidence in big strategic decision making.
This, of course, is the basis of Clayton Christensen
Exactly.
theory.
And it's
this
so
is,
misunderstood, I think.
But I think it's very important that, or what you said at the beginning, of differentiating: are we an holding company, regardless of the corporate governance, or are we an integrator? Because there are a lot of companies that they maybe at the upper level they think they are an integrator, but they are actually a sum of the parts, and they don't ask really, or they don't have a common denominator such as a client. I see it in the defense industry, I see it in the food industry, and so forth. But now, let's build again on what you just said, and to say, okay, you identified that there is a challenge, a disruption. The client needs to be served through the lifelong journey, or the client needs to be answered a question. How do you get the people? How do you get the people to buy in and understand that? Because that's the secret of the why. And then we go in the how and the what. How did you get in such large organization with full of talented people and probably full of different opinions? To cohesively tackle.
So I think in all instances, the first lever you pull is let's get some consultants in. And I've been one of those consultants. And actually, having been one of the consultants, I became more and more unsure whether that was the right answer. And so what I've tried to do is build very, very inclusive strategy processes, at the heart of which I use scenario planning. Because scenario planning allows me to build that capability, but also to involve, in some instances, 400, 500 people in the strategy. Mm-hmm. So this isn't going to be something that's just 6 people with phenomenal analytical and PowerPoint skills sort of revealing the answer. This is something that when we roll it out, everybody can see their contribution. And if they see that contribution, they'll buy into it. And if they buy into it, they might do it. Because that's what I want. I want them to do it. So what I've done is I've leveraged my inevitably small team. I don't know a single chief strategy officer that doesn't think they've got a team that's big enough to do what they want to do. How do I scale that team? So what I do is the first thing is you start to build the scenarios. And just building the scenarios creates more capability because you bring in people from across the organization and you build these futures. And just the act of doing that helps people across the organisation think differently. It's like, I'd never thought of that. And you're building scenarios that have to be plausible. They don't have to be probable. I'm not interested whether they're probable or whether you like them or prefer them. It's just plausible. And we use lots and lots of parameters. We think about globalization versus nationalization. We think about, in Pearson's, for example, a push towards learner centricity versus a push towards teacher centricity. And you can start to build those on axes and you start to think about these, 3, 4 futures. And you map them out in quite a lot of detail. And just that helps people engage with strategy that they've never done before. And once you've got those strategies in place, what we then do is we use the team that develop the scenarios, which might be 20 people, and we send them out into the organisation and beyond. So you might interview 200 people within your organisation. That might be a team at a time or focus groups. And we certainly interview people outside the organisation, customers, suppliers, people who used to work at competitors, to explore each of the scenarios. And we had a fairly structured approach where we'd say, under this scenario, don't worry about whether it's likely, just imagine it's happened. Let's imagine BSI is successful. What would that mean for our proposition? What would that mean for what we do? What would that mean for how we're organised? What would that mean for our use of technology? What would that mean for the type of people we need? So really bringing that down to some pragmatic, what would that mean at quite a tangible level? And then what you do is you've interviewed these people and you get your 20 back together and then you go, right, what have we just learned? And there'll be some themes that, doesn't matter what the scenario is true. So in Pearson, for example, what we realised was that under all of the scenarios, we would win if we were as global an organisation as possible. What the last mile looked like would be different, but there was an edge in being global. In Kantar, for example, we realised that actually recognising that organisations that were multi-market, regardless of whether it's nationalistic or a global organisation, would want our services. So there were some that were a no-brainer, that we should just do, and others that thought, well, actually, depending on which scenario emerges, we would do X versus Y. So then the question becomes, what are the indicators that would tell us where that might be going so that we've rehearsed that future and we can react really quickly?
I mean, this is incredibly interesting. And my trigger question is, but building scenarios, and even if you have very good triggers, there will always be trade-offs. There will always choice to be made. And those choices could be radical, less radical. You are chief transformation officer, so there are some that are more transformative, others that are more along continuous improvement. So how do you make an organization of those size? Is it a top-down approach on choices, or are choices then cascaded down and different teams can adopt and adapt the choices?
I mean, I'm going to cop out and say it's both. But I think that's where the role of the strategy function helps. How do we gather insights from the markets about where the markets might be going? And how do we understand from an enterprise perspective where we can make our investments? Because that tends to be talked down. We have a capital allocation model. We've sort of agreed that we might change it, but we've got it in place. So you're trying to match what you're learning from the ground, keeping an eye on competitors and all that sort of thing, with what you think some of the constraints are within your organisation. But I think going back to the inclusive point, what became very interesting is suddenly I had 300 people who were interested in the outside world, who would start going to their customers and saying, apart from us, who's the most interesting person you've talked to in the last 6 months? And can you give me their contact details? And then they go and see them. And that way we started to find partners, we started to find emerging competitors, we started to find talent. Oh, simply because we'd awakened a load of executives to think outside their organisation.
It's a bit like in basketball. There is a very famous Coach K coach, the one that always says organization typically they act like a basketball team that is very disjointed, so like our open hands. But the one that really succeed is when they close and they are like a fist. Having all this inclusiveness. Of course, it's more. Takes more time probably. You will have to be ready to agree to disagree. But at the end, if you are unified around a set of decisions, that's how you create a fist versus the five fingers. And but now, of course, that's all good. You've made the choices. You've made a lot of people inclusive. You already kind of hinted about execution, but how do you transform those choices, those decisions you took about the markets you want to play or you want to exit, how you're going to win in these markets, the value proposition, you hinted at that. And then, of course, the operating model or the target operating model. All of those are decisions, but then at some point, the pneumatic the rubber has to hit the road. So how do you get this into planning? How do you get this into budgets? How do you get this into people's action plans?
I mean,
in such massive organizations.
That is often the multi-billion-dollar question. Interestingly, a lot of my last 3 roles have been I've been responsible for strategy, change, and innovation, and I love that. If you can get those 3 to work together, it's kind of magical. So you're not doing strategy in isolation of how you do the change, and you're not doing strategy in isolation of the art of the possible, which is what my innovation teams are worried about. So inherently, we're trying to always think, even as we're creating the strategy, how would that work and how would we do it and what would be the gaps? The strategy plan budget issue, typically we've taken quite a structured way to that. So we work very closely with finance. The finance and HR are my key business partners because it's about the money and the people. And so what we have is we have a 5-year strategy, 5 to 7 year strategy, which I lead with my colleagues supporting me. We then have a 3-year plan, and I think in most organisations we confuse a plan and a strategy. So for me, a strategy is about going to the future and working back, and a plan is about the current state moving forward. And the problem you have is that when you're incremental, current state moving forward, you take a sort of 3%, 4%, and then when you realise where you want to be, you end up with much higher, and you end up with a much steeper line. And I call the difference between that line the leadership challenge. So how do you resolve that? And you resolve it in the plan. So the budget then becomes a straight last year plus whatever it's going to be. So we've got a sort of future, which is set by the strategy, and the plan is really exploring that leadership challenge of the difference between current state moving forward and the future state moving back. And that's where you need to then cascade into the divisions. You need to make sure, because you've had an inclusive process, that everybody in the divisions understands the whole picture, rather than we're just building it up from the bottom. So that's where dialogue matters. And for me, it is about the power of the conversation, making sure it's informed, it's robust, and that informs a really good plan. It sounds really obvious, but often what you've really done is you've done a financial model, you've taken this year, you've said, we need to be here, and we add it all up, and it's like, here you go. And then you don't feel empowered, because I haven't really been involved in what the target should be, and I don't think I've got the resources. So it's the issue of resources are always scarcer than you want. So you've got to, in the plan, have that really robust, difficult conversation. And I think that's what defines the quality of the leadership team. How prepared are you to have those really robust conversations to resolve the difference between the future state back and the current state forward?
It's super interesting what you're saying, and it comes back to another conversation I had with another guest that mentioned a lot of companies nowadays, they have transformative plans, and he, in a kind of very challenging way, said, and most of those challenging or most of those plans that are called transformative, they're not transformative at all. And he told me a very, very simple tool, which I would like you to think, because you already gave me another very good insight about the leadership challenge between the plan and the strategy, prediction. And for him, the test is very simple. He said, if you call something transformative, I want to see the last 3 budgets, and then I proportion it to 100, and I see if anything has changed in the proportional allocation of resources. If everything is pretty much in the same bands, we're talking something transformative in a very bad way, because people underneath, they will get very anxious, say, oh, this is transformative, but in reality, nothing changes. People, allocation, OPEX or CAPEX doesn't change, so you cannot change code, because if it's only the outcome that is transformative, but you don't transform in the input, it is most probable that it's never going to happen, because that's wishful thinking. So what's your view on that? Because you already, this idea of the leadership challenge, which is bridging the plan, which let's call it the inertial or the business as usual, and then the strategy, which takes in account a future that is not there yet, but you can envision. But also the challenge of calling something transformative that is really not transformative.
My team will tell you that they need to drop the T-bomb, as I call it. If you want to say the word transformation, you need to be really careful, because we drop the T-bomb way too early.
Okay.
So we do a lot of things which we call transformative, which are not. So let me give you an example in Kantar. So I get very concerned with the phrase digital transformation, because the key word in that isn't digital, it's transformation. But the word that everyone focuses on is digital. So, for example, whether it's, in surveys, moving it from paper to an iPad, that's not transformational. That's just digitizing an analog model. Moving a textbook to an iPad in text under glass, that's not transformational, it's just digitizing an analog model. So that if you're going to drop the T-bomb, my test is, show me that you've abandoned the analog model. So in market research, digital digitizing an analog model is moving your survey from pad and paper to an iPad. Transformation is I don't need to ask you any questions actually about what beer you like or what shampoo you use, because I know your Twitter handle, I know you know Facebook, I can figure all that out. I can go on and I can have a look. I know who your friends are and I know what they think about beer and shampoo. And not only can I figure out what you think, I can figure out what you're going to think. So instead of me going and collecting a load of data, taking 3 months to do it, whether I collect it on an iPad or not, I now don't need to talk to you. I can do it like that, and I predict.
You created
what the
a
brand will
digital
be.
twin on me.
Yeah, so I can do it in a week, not 3 months, and I don't tell you what the brand was worth 3 months ago when I started. I'll tell you what it's going to be worth in a month's time. That's an acceptable use of transformation. Everything else is just digitizing an analog business.
I love this point about the digital transformation, because so many people is like human transformation, and then you look at the allocation of resources still the same.
Exactly.
You know, if you're looking at using 1/10 or using the same people to do 10 times more, then probably we can talk about transformation. So now to close up, we already talked about execution, and how do you measure success in your strategy? What how, is it based on the initial plan versus, but as we know, strategy changes all the time. So when you say my 5 year strategic plan, I don't think anyone sane these days will tell you that you can then evaluate it 5 years later, because in between the 5 years, you will have changed it maybe 4 or 5 times.
Yeah.
And so how do you measure success? How do you know that, the effort was worth the return? Or the returns were
I'm a really big fan of Henry Mintzberg, and he has a really simple 2x2 grid. The question is, did you deliver your strategy, and were you successful? And everyone assumes that delivering the strategy box and being successful box is the box you're after. So everyone wants to be in the column of I delivered my strategy. I want to be in the row of I was successful. So obviously, if you didn't deliver your strategy and delivered your plan, you're an idiot. So you're in that's your problem. If you delivered your strategy but you weren't successful, that's not great. If you delivered your strategy and you were successful, you're probably lucky. The most likely is you didn't quite deliver your strategy, but you were successful. Hence, strategy is emergent. So the trite answer isn't whether I delivered the strategy, it's whether I was successful.
Yeah.
And so I disconnect those. And then there are the measures of, market share, customer satisfaction, customer insight, predictive value. But increasingly, particularly when I was at Pearson and certainly here at BSI, now I'm at BSI, we're very, very driven by our purpose. And we are looking at how do we measure our purpose. So BSI is a company by royal charter, so I've no shareholders to worry about, which is a joy and a curse sometimes. But our board is as worried about our profitability, as worried about our impact as they are about our profitability. And so we are now looking at, to what degree does our work improve patients' lives? To what degree does our work save clients carbon? To what degree does our work enable, less water wastage? And so that's, I think, that's there's another podcast right there.
Yeah.
But I think
we should.
What we're seeing is organizations starting to measure success beyond so-called shareholder value.
And it builds very nicely on the fact that there is you're an academic as well as a practitioner, and a lot of research around it, as the winning ambition of Roger Martin, but also the balanced scorecard of.
So I was involved in creating the balanced scorecard.
Oh wow, that's why and I'm always a big fan of putting the two together, because a winning ambition should have a purpose and a vision on the long term. But vision and mission and purposes are very emotional. But the problem is that a lot of people interpret them in different ways. So attaching a balanced scorecard, having a good balance of financial, customer, process, and people can only help. And the more it can fit in a page, the better. But now let's close by asking the million or the billion question, which is, for all of the strategic thinkers that are listening to our podcast, what are the big 3 lessons that you would like them to retain to be better at strategic thinking? Distilling out of your lifelong experience and what you told us today.
Well, that is a really hard question. I think there are a couple of things that I sort of hang on to and I always try and encourage my team to do. I think the first is to be very, very, very comfortable with massive levels of uncertainty. I often say that I have very strong opinions lightly held. It's no good having no opinions, but you've got to have an opinion, but you've got to be prepared to change it in the light of data. I think that's the first thing.
Being comfortable in being uncomfortable.
Exactly. I think the other is strategy is a verb, not a noun. It is a continuous thing. It isn't about the document, it's about the capability, and it's about ownership. So there's no point in being right. It's whether it gets done. It's whether you're in the were we successful row versus did we deliver the strategy column. And I think the last is that you've got to tie it to action. Yeah, I'm an engineer by training. You know, whether it gets done is what makes me happy, frankly. I don't sit back and think, oh, that is just a masterpiece strategy. I just want to see it done. And so you've got to tie it to execution. And I'm always challenging my teams to make sure that we understand what the business is really all about, we understand how it works, as well as all the external factors, but have that operational awareness, as well as that customer awareness, market awareness, etc.
Wonderful. Jonathan, thank you very much. This was as incisive as I could have wished, and I'm sure that all our audience will enjoy it. I'm also looking forward to work with you on the article that we will derive from this podcast. So thank you very much again.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.